that story continues on with you. You are the direct continuation of that story. There's a continuum between you and all the people that have come before you. And your story, understanding of yourself and understanding of your story is incomplete, I think, until you reach back into your ancestors and discover their stories, discover their struggles, rediscover their knowledge that they had, and learn from that, and remember that you are their story. It did not end when they died. You are their continuation.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Stories from Real Life. I'm your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Thanks for joining me for the podcast where personal stories can have a global impact. As you heard in the intro, our guest today is folklorist and author of the Old Grandma's Tree series of books, Joseph Bolton. Joseph, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm very excited to be here today with you.
I'm excited to have you here so I can hear your stories. My first question for you today is, how does a West Point grad and Army Ranger end up writing books about old grandmothers?
Well, I think, when I was a child, my mother's family is French Canadian, and I was always fascinated with that and always wanted to know as much about my family's history as I could learn. And, of course, back then, you can only, know so much. You may know about your grandparents. I may know about my mother's grandparents and a little bit, but there's a great mystery there. But after I, retired from the Army in 2007, and as all those wonderful tools we have now today to research your family's history, Ancestry.com, we got the DNA test. So I used those to research my mother's family history. And so using that, I was able to rediscover all her ancestors in Quebec, right to the very beginning of when they first settled out in Nova Scotia back in the mid 1600s, the very beginning of Canada. And not only that, I also discovered a very special ancestor. Her name was Mitio Goku, and she was an Algonquin woman who lived in the mid 1600s in Trois-Rivières in Quebec. And in fact, she is the old grandmother of the Old Grandmother's Tree Stories. And so what I did is I took her story, what we known about it, the facts, and I retold it in a folklore style setting. So it's one of the things that makes this book unique. A lot of people have written books about their ancestors before, especially if they have well-known ancestors. But, a lot of them are very true, try to stay true to the facts and try to be a historic, retelling. But what I did was I reimagined her story in a folklore setting. And the reason why I did that is because folklore and folk tales are a universal language throughout the world. Every culture has folk tales. And the language of folk tales, they talk about the human experience, moral lessons, living our lives. And so I took that language, the language I used to retell her story. So in addition to historic facts about her, I also added in Native American or First Nations, as they say in Canada, trickster animal characters based on Native American mythology and folklore. And I also reimagined Quebec with a little bit of magic in there. And so I immersed all those ingredients together and created what is right now 2-volume series of books. There's 10 stories within the 2 volumes that we have right now. They're fully illustrated with full color illustrations. There's 450 illustrations within the two books that we have right now, and 40,000 words of text. So it's a unique combination of written word, but heavily illustrated. And the words and the pictures, and they're very beautiful illustrations. If they work together to tell the story, almost like, 2 halves of your lung, you need them both to breathe. So the story breathes through the words and these illustrations. So, and
yeah, I want to talk more about your ancestry.
Sure.
A little bit deeper.
Sure.
I'm glad you pronounce your
Yes.
grandmother's name because there's no way I could have said it correctly. But you gave your mom an ancestry DNA test,
And I
that
would
led
apologize.
you to
Yes.
discovering this ancestor who
Ninth
was an
great grandmother.
Algonquin.
Yes. And she was an Algonquin woman.
Who was baptized by the name of Marie Madeline.
Yes, she was.
Can you tell me more about her?
And she actually had several names. She was a grandmother. She was Mitio Goku. She probably had she may have, when she was married to her second husband, Pierre Cauque, was a French settler. She became Madame Cauque, for example. But let me backtrack a little bit and just tell how I found that ancestor. So when we were growing up, my mother and my mother's aunts and her parents always said, we're 100% French. And so that was the story we had. So when I gave my mother and 5 of her siblings the DNA test, she's the oldest of 11 children, actually. And I give them the DNA test, and it turns out, well, they're mostly French, but they're also mixed with a little bit of English, a little bit of Irish, a little bit of Spanish, or specifically Basque. And also Native American DNA was there also. And we didn't know about that at the time, but there it was. All my mother and her siblings had all kind of showed that Native American DNA. And it took me probably about 2 years to find who that connection were. And I found 4 Native American, I call gateway ancestors. And of them, the most well documented was Mitio Goku. And her story was very well documented by the Jesuit priest who lived in Trois-Rivières. And here's what we know of the facts of her life. So when she was 22 years old, and it was about 1652 in Trois-Rivières, she was married to another Algonquin man, and they had 2 small children. They probably may have been no more than 5, maybe 4 and 3. They were very young. And the Mohawks, another First Nations tribe who lived in New York at the time, moved up into Quebec and attacked and raided their village. And in the raid, her husband was killed, and her 2 small children were kidnapped by the Mohawks and taken away. And she never saw them again, and she never learned what happened to them. They were just gone. So here she is at 22, and she lost everything. She lost her husband, and she lost her children. And yet, 5 years later, she marries a French settler named Pierre Cauque. And together, they had a whole new family. They rebuilt their lives, or she rebuilt her life. They had, I think, at least 5 children between the 2 of them. And they have today thousands of descendants in Canada and the United States. So when I looked at her situation, being so young and to lose everything, it's very easy for a person to fall into despair. Maybe you become bitter. But at the very end of her life, and this is probably the most key thing of all the records we have about her, but at the end of her life, the priest of Trois-Rivières, the French priest, wrote about her about a day after she died. And he said, Mitio Goku lived a full life with dignity, respect, and love. A courageous and loving Algonquin woman. And I really have gravitated to that very short eulogy and epitaph. And I thought, any of us will have done well if at the end of our life, others can say that we lived a life of dignity, respect, love, and courage. And so I took that statement about her and I recreated what kind of life she probably have, lived, to have someone say that about her. So she was obviously a person of strength and of courage and rebuilding, and I think that echoes today in her descendants, throughout Canada and the United States. And so the very first 2 stories of Volume 1 of Old Grandmother's Tree are specifically about her. Other stories are about her descendants in Quebec, but she's almost mentioned in almost every story, even if they take place a couple hundred years later. People still remember her. So what she did and the life she led echoed forward with her children and her descendants. And I think that's also part of what we want. We want to have the good that we do in our lives echo forward with our children, our grandchildren, our great grandchildren, and on to generations past that. And so here we are. We have this two-book series, and I'm writing, just about finishing up the third book of the series. It'll be coming out by the end of the summer. It's going to be called The Dance of Creation, and it's going to be set in the same story world or story universe as Old Grandmother's Tree, except that it's going to be a retelling of the creation of the world and where all these trickster animal characters came from, how they were created. And then the other book I'm going to be releasing probably early next year is going to be called All Around You There Is a Light, and it's going to take place at the very end of Mitio Goku's life, the last couple of days of her life, and she's retelling the story of the attack and what happened immediately afterward to her granddaughter, who is of French, at that time is French and Algonquin. But she's trying to pass on a little bit of what she learned in her own life and a little bit of her Algonquin heritage to her grandchildren. So there's a lot in that story. I'm very excited when that one comes out, when that'll be coming out next year, or early next year. So the series is ongoing, and I'm very excited here to talk to you about it.
Yeah, that sounds great. Genealogy is something that's always been very important to me, and I've done a lot of genealogy research on my family, and I've even written 2 books about my family's history. And so I'm curious, how or in what ways do your stories encourage people to explore
Well, I
their
think
own
every family
roots?
has fascinating stories, and there's stories there's stories that will probably give you joy, will surprise you, and some of the stories might even shock you. Um, I but I do think that we have to keep in mind that each of us is a continuation of the story of our ancestors. So if you were writing a story about your ancestors, or your ancestor was telling a story about themselves, their story did not end when that ancestor of yours died. That story continues on with you. You are the direct continuation of that story. There's a continuum between you and all the people that have come before you. And your story, understanding of yourself and understanding of your story is incomplete, I think, until you reach back into your ancestors and discover their stories, discover their struggles, rediscover their knowledge that they had, and learn from that, and remember that you are their story. It did not end when they died, but you are their continuation.
Yeah, that's very true and very interesting too. And with my own
Mm-hmm.
family research, I ran into some different kinds of roadblocks with being a descendant of enslaved people. Whereas I can only go back in my family's history about 6 generations before we run into the slavery era where no personalized records were ever
Right.
kept. So my ancestors before 1870 were not really listed by name, they were listed as property. So I had to go. I took my first book, The Eyes of Texans. You can see the cover of the book behind me. And each generation each chapter follows a generation of one of my ancestors. And I retell their story in a first person voice as I imagine the story to be based on my research. And the stories, the people came alive to me through those stories. Was that your experience?
That's correct. That's very true. And that sounds like, a very fascinating book that you've created. And especially, and I think that you've touched on how important it is to you have a sense of continuity between each chapter. A chapter doesn't stand alone. It naturally leads on to the follow-on chapter, and that's the way our lives work in context of all the people
What
that have
makes
come before
folktales,
us.
traditional folktales, relevant in today's modern context?
Well, I think folktales, for one thing, they're universal. Every culture has them. Many of the stories that are folk tales are very ancient. Many of them are thousands of years old and were first told perhaps around a campfire, oral stories. They were passed on orally even before there was a written word. So folk tales are deeply ingrained in what it means to be a human being. And the other thing is, I've read folk tales from all different cultures, Chinese, Japanese folk tales from Africa, traditional American folk tales, Native American folk tales. And although they are different in their particulars about their stories, there is a universality to them in talking about what it means to be a human being. And many of them contain lessons about how to live a good life. And folktales are also universally entertaining. They more than more instruction, but they're very universal entertaining. So all the things I just used now to describe folktales is still true today in the 21st century. That doesn't change because human nature is the same. So as long as human nature is the same, folktales are going to be definitely a part of.
Can you share a lesser-known folktale that holds a special significance for you?
A lesser-known folktale. Oh my gosh. I don't, off the top of my head, I think I really don't have one right at the tip of my tongue, but I always think the ones that I always fascinate me are the ones that are tragic. And there's a lot of folk tales that have like lessons that are tragic, unrequited love, or those are the stories that really reach out to me because I think they're set up that way because they really want to drive home the lesson about human life and human experience. So I really don't have a one off like that what I can really describe that way, except maybe talking generalities. But I love folk tales of all the different cultures. I was fascinated with Greek mythology as a child, and many of those stories are also very much kind of tragic in the way the characters are. But I've always been fascinated with them. But I don't have one in particular though.
What role do folk tales play in fostering community connections?
Well, I think that they give a sense of commonality, of culture within that area. They talk about the world around them and a culture that exists in any part of the world. That folk tales are set in the place where these people live that tell these folk tales. So the environment is the same. So one of the lessons that folk tales will talk about, of course, is how to live and thrive within the environment that they live in. And I also think that they become like a thread that carries through with all the people that have lived before, because those are the stories. Those stories just didn't become created like the generation before you were born. These are stories that have been told by your ancestors on and on and on, generations before. So it's passing on the collective wisdom of a society gets passed on through its mythology and through its folk tales.
You mentioned hundreds of illustrations in your books. Tell me about those illustrations and about the people who illustrated them for you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I had two illustrators that helped me with this book because it's so big. The first illustrator that helped me was a young woman named Masami Kyoto. She lives in Manhattan, and she is a storyboard artist. And she's worked on designing commercials for like the Super Bowl, for example. She had the Doritos commercials on the Super Bowl a couple of years ago. But her job in the story creating process was that we worked together, and she would do the rough sketches. She would design the rough sketches of where these illustrations would go in the story and what those illustrations would show in the story. So she was the person who, if I use an analogy, would go through the forest and kind of cut down the trees and kind of help create that rough dirt road through the forest. So that was the first part. The second part was for the final illustrations, I worked with a very talented young artist named Natasha Pelly Smith. She's based in Toronto. She was trained in Paris as an artist, very talented young woman. And we would go through and look at these rough sketches that Masami, the storyboard artist, created. And then she would add her colors and her own techniques on top of those rough sketches and create these beautiful illustrations that are full color. And one thing that Natasha is very talented on is that her illustrations have a three-dimensionality to them that you see, and really a depth and a warmth. And it was very much a challenge because the large number of illustrations that we actually had to do. So we had to research how did First Nations people in Canada live in the 17th century? How did they dress? What kind of homes did they live in? We did our best to research and try to make sure our pictures were authentic to the time period that people actually lived in. We also have to make sure the characters are consistent. We have to make sure that their expressions will convey the proper emotions of that. And the stories are also very varied. Some stories are very thoughtful and poignant. Other stories, because we're dealing with trickster animal characters, are actually a little farcical and funny and humorous. And that's typical of folk tales as well. So she had to have a range of expressions and a range of feeling for all the stories particular to that story, in particular in the book. So it was about a 2-year project to actually create those 350 illustrations. And she's going to be starting the next third book. She's actually going to be starting this week, The Dance of Creation. We expect to have that finished, the final illustrations done in a couple of months, and the book will be published. And then the other book that I mentioned called All Around You There Is a Light, Masami right now is halfway done creating the rough sketches for that story. And so when Natasha finishes The Dance of Creation, she's going to immediately go into the next one. So it's a continuous process. So all three of us are working together to help create these stories. And also, I will make some changes sometimes to the text of the story based on the illustrations that Natasha and Masami, the artists, have actually come up with. They quite often have had great ideas to input into the stories, little details and stuff. And I said, that's a great idea. And so I will incorporate that into the text.
Did you base some of your trickster character animals on real people?
Yes, it's an interesting question. Oh, that's definitely true. For example, there's two trickster characters, and they're brothers, and they're one's Mewin the bear, and the other one is Azaban the raccoon. And they frequently get into trouble. They like to steal food from the people, human beings. One story, they stole a tractor. Another story, they ate pie. They stole pies, and then to replace it, they tried to bake a pie, which was a total disaster because bears and raccoons obviously can't cook pies. So, but they're based on myself and my brother David, my late brother David. Him and I, when we were kids, we would do a lot of that stuff. We were very mischievous children. So a lot of them are based on those two characters in particular, based on me. The other characters that I think are definitely kind of based on people I know and myself is a turtle named Uncle McKee. He's a very wise turtle, very old, very wise, but sometimes he feels a little insecure about himself and what he can do. And he wants, as an older person, he wants to be relevant with the younger persons in his family. And he has a very close relationship with his nephew, Poku, who's a moose. And there's one scene in the second book where they're walking back together to Mount Orford in Quebec, where they live. That's their home, after having a day of adventures. And Makisha's sitting on the back of Poku, and they're having a conversation. And they're reflecting on what happened that day. And then during that day, they had kind of a misadventures where Uncle McKeish thought he could do more than he could. He's only a turtle. So there was a contest, an axe throwing contest, for example. He can't lift up an axe. He's just a little turtle. He was kind of frustrated by that, and he kind of made excuses about why he couldn't do it. Like, oh, there's a magic spell on this axe that prevents me from picking it up. And there's another contest where he does a log rolling contest with a big burly lumberjack. And here he has a little turtle on a log, and he's trying to spin the log so he can knock this lumberjack off. He can't do that either. There's only a little turtle. So he feels bad about that and a little embarrassed. Anyway, he's riding back on the back of his nephew, Poku the moose, and they're having a conversation. And basically he says, you know, nephew, you must be ashamed of me. And his nephew goes, why is that, uncle? He says, well, I couldn't throw the axe, and I couldn't knock the lumberjack off the log. And his nephew tells him, well, what else do you expect? You're a turtle. You're not going to be able to throw an axe or throw somebody off a log. And then, you know, the McKeish is kind of like, he sits there quietly for a moment. They walk a little further, and finally Uncle McKeish says, you know, nephew, you must really get tired of me. I always repeat all my stories. And his nephew said, Poku the moose says to him, oh no, uncle. I said, I learn something new with every retelling of your stories. And finally, McKeish is frustrated because he wants to feel bad for himself. And he says, why won't you let me feel sorry for myself, nephew? And his nephew, Poku the moose, says to him, uncle, I don't care that you could not throw the axe. I don't care that you couldn't knock the lumberjack off the log. You are the best uncle to me, and I love you. And that conversation kind of reflects a lot about where I am in my life. I'm actually both characters in that story. Sometimes I'm Uncle McKeish. I have younger nephews and nieces that are in their 30s. So sometimes I'm like trying to be relevant to them and have that relationship with them, but there's still that generation gap. Other times I'm Poku the moose, because I have my mother's siblings are still alive. I have aunts and uncles that are in their 80s now. And so they're in a different place in their life. And I think the line that really speaks the most in there I mentioned is when McKeish was saying that you must get tired of me because I repeat all my stories. And when Poku comes back and says, no, I learned something new with every retelling. And I think that is the key lesson in that chapter, that the younger generation must approach their elders with patience, love, and respect. And even if they repeat their stories, so what? If you pay attention, you'll probably learn something new with every retelling that your uncle or your grandparent is telling you when they repeat that story. And so that's probably one of my favorite chapters, and that one is probably very autobiographical.
Do you have any other favorite characters in the book?
Besides Mitio Goku, I think she is definitely my favorite because especially when you see the next book comes after that talks about her how her life unfolded. The fact that she was able to come from a point of what could have been very much despair and bitterness, the fact that she was able to build her life, that people around her saw her as a person of love, respect, and courage, that is something I admire, and she's definitely one of my favorite characters in the book. And like our ancestors, she's only the main character right now. In the 2 volumes I have, she's only the main character for 2 stories out of the 10. But yet, she permeates the entire book series. She's mentioned in there. She implicitly affects how characters are acting, even her descendants are behaving and how they live their lives, even hundreds of years later. So she's definitely one of my favorite
I'm guessing
characters.
you
Also
used
in the
her
book.
as a model for incorporating those Native American folktales into your own stories.
Oh, very much so. Very much. And, the story actually begins, the very first story actually begins with her grandparents. They're waking up early in the morning. They're laying there in bed and they're talking about Mitio Goku and say, it's been 5 years. It's been long enough. And the grandfather says he goes to the French village. He has an idea. He says, you know what? I know she's in love with this man named Pierre Calque, and I know that he loves her. So his idea is he's going to get these two together and bring them together. But along the way, the grandfather encounters some of the trickster animal characters as well, including Maquiche the turtle, a raven named Whiskey Jan, and they kind of change the course, affect his don't prevent him from taking a direct path over, in a good way, not in a bad way. So yeah, because of her culture, I created these Native American trickster animal characters. And the interesting thing is that these characters are not directly based one for one with Native American folktales, but I would say that they're inspired by Native American folktale trickster characters, for example. So a lot of the characters I created myself. Their adventures are original to my own imagination and the way they react or interact with the other characters. But because if you read the stories, though, you'll say that sounds familiar. Have I seen this before? And that's because it's in the language of the folktale, which is universal. So you're going to recognize it right away. But they're all original. But yes, because she comes from the Algonquin community, I did use those trickster animal characters that are inspired by Native American folktales.
What are the overall themes in your books?
I think one is the love of family and connection. Faith is also very important in the book. I come from a Catholic background, and there's a lot of Catholic thinking and Christian Catholic thinking in the books. Although I don't have the word Catholic is nowhere in the books at all, and but that's definitely a theme as well. And I think it's also overcoming adversity in your life. I think also the value of probably the biggest theme is the value of storytelling. The value of storytelling as an art that we use to tell deeper truths about our lives. That is a theme in the story. I think respecting our elders and respecting where we come from and maintaining that sense of where we come from is also a theme of the story of the books as well. And above all else, they're entertaining. I was going to say the other thing is they're entertaining. Their books are good. They're fun to read, and a lot of people who have the books, they tell me that they enjoy reading them with their children and their grandchildren, and the kids love them because they're funny, they're entertaining, they're thoughtful, but they're not baby books. They don't talk down to children. And they're also written in a way that adults can also enjoy the stories as well. But they love sharing them in a family, and that's very much the theme of the book.
I've got a young granddaughter who lives with me, and I'm going to have to get a copy of your books so I can read them to her. I think she would really enjoy them.
Oh, definitely. Oh, she'll like them, and you'll enjoy reading them too.
I'm definitely going to have to do that. So, when you started writing, did you foresee the scope of this when you first had the idea of putting these stories down in a book form?
No, I did not. The very first story that I wrote of all the book series is called La Troupe de Sabots, which is in French means the gang of hoofs. And what it was just a funny little story I wrote. And I wrote a story about my great-great-grandparents' farm in Quebec. And at midnight in 1902, in March of 1902, the farm animals wake up in the barn. They grab the toboggan, they sneak up to the top of the hill, and they go tobogganing down the hill at midnight. And my great-great-grandmother comes out. She wants to chastise them, but at the end of the story, she just hops on the toboggan with them and slides down the hill. And it was a very cute story. And that's where it was. But I said, I really like these characters. So I started to write another story about those farm animals. But what really changed the stories was that when I was working with the artists, and it was Masami who first came up with this idea, um, my great great grandmother in the story is wearing a shawl. And we decided to make the shawl the same color as the northern lights in the sky on that story of what the farm animals are sliding down the hill at midnight. So that became kind of a doorway to the rest of the story. Because as it turned out, the great great grandmother I was writing about was a descendant of Mitio Goku. That's how I descend to Mitio Goku. So the shawl became magic, and then it became, oh, where did the shawl come from? Well, it came from her ancestor, Mitio Goku, and that shawl was passed down from generation to generation all the way to my great great grandmother. So that became kind of like a thread that led back to Mitio Goku. And then I kind of developed forward those stories about her. But it was not something that I had originally had planned out. I didn't have a whole map of the stories. It kind of became a thread that I found and picked up and kind of pulled at. And behind that thread, as I pulled it closer to myself, I realized that there was a deeper story there to be told. And when I've talked to other writers, every writer has a different style. Some people like to write an outline. For myself, I don't do outlines. I think a story kind of percolates within my imagination at a subconscious level until one day it just bursts out, and I have to sit in front of the computer and I have to type it up. And I type a draft right away. And I also kind of let my characters tell me what they're going to do within the environment or the situation that I kind of set them in. So it's very much a mystery exactly how that creative, it really touches on that mystery of the creative process when you use your imagination, how it works. A lot of it, the process happens at a level that we don't really understand at a conscious level.
Before we go today, I just have a couple more questions for you. First, what advice would you like to leave for the listeners?
First of all, you need to listen to, reach out and maintain and rebuild that relationship with your grandparents, your aunts and uncles. I think one of the things I know now, I'm 61, is that only now I understand the questions that I should have been asking my grandparents when they were alive, when I was younger, when I should have asked. So the first advice is reach out to your elders in your family and capture their stories, engage them, and listen to them while you have them, because you won't have them forever. The second is that if you're looking for a book or a series of books to read and to share with your children, your grandchildren, then I would invite you to get copies of these books and read that. And even if it isn't this story in particular, find stories to read to your children and your grandchildren. So I would say is maintain that continuity of storytelling from your ancestors, your grandparents, great uncles,
and
also to your children.
My last question. Can you tell the listeners how they can get a copy of your book?
Okay, well, the books are available on Amazon. So if you go in there and Google or reach in there, search for Old Grandmother's Tree, you'll find them that way. But even better, if you go to my website, oldgrandmotherstree.com, and it's written as one word, you'll find links to the books to buy them on Amazon. And the books are available in French as well. So you can find the links to the French versions. There is a Wikipedia page within the website that has a list of all the characters and settings, and I think I have well over 100 entries in there. So really fascinating, especially if you want to get a sense of what the story's about. Just go through the Wikipedia. I think you'll find it really interesting. There's also my biography and the biography of Natasha, the main artist of the stories as well, and links to other podcasts that I've also have been on. But that's where you start. Start the website or go right to Amazon.
Yeah, that sounds good. And I will be leaving links to Joseph's books in the show notes for this episode. Our guest today has been Joseph Bolton. Joseph, thank you so much for being here today.
I have enjoyed it very much. Thank you for having me
Please
on
go to my
today.
website at podcastreallife.com for more information about my guests and the things we discussed today. That's it for today's episode of Stories from Real Life. Join us again next time for another chance to learn from each other. Until then, don't forget to shine your light wherever you go.